tech is so cool. And technology products are so cool. And I find, I always joke around with my team that I feel like when we market tech products, we're both their best friend and their worst enemy, because we'll come in and say, tell us the 3 things you love about what you're doing. And the answer we'll get is, hey, we love 20 things. We'll be like, nope, 3, just 3.
Wing It Podcast, goosedigital.com, episode 88. Who do we have?
Kevin Butler, Chris O'Neill,
Mike Leon.
Michael Turksani.
a guest.
Mike Leon.
Great to be here.
Yay.
Leon.
Is this our first in-person guest of 2023?
Of 23.
Of fiscal
Yeah.
23 /
Yes.
calendar 23?
That's correct.
Not fiscal 23. No.
Calendar, yes.
Yeah, calendar, yes.
I'm honored. I
Yeah.
am honored.
Good to have
That's
you.
why you gave me the good cream in the coffee today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only been there a bit.
Yeah.
See the bad couple weeks.
Couple weeks, but they're hermetically sealed, so we're good. Yeah, well, welcome aboard. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
As you know, our podcast is really well attended, really well listened to. A couple of million views a year. So yeah, we're gonna boost your brand up.
All right. Love it.
By going through this today.
Most
okay.
importantly, I was going to say, you're just going to have your LinkedIn feed blown up with these little snippets that we release every 3 days.
Yeah.
It's just going to be tagged in just all the time.
Oh yeah, we're gonna be tagging it and promoting them, and
It's going to be great.
it's gonna be great.
Oh, excellent. People could say they knew me when.
Yeah.
Excited
Yeah,
about
before Wing It and after Wing It,
Exactly.
right? Exactly. In fact, we got to go on your podcast, so that's another thing we got to do, right?
Absolutely. Let's look that up.
Yeah. So, but yeah, so cool. This is great. We wanted to do this for a while. We met. I don't know how many years ago was that now. It's because with the COVID kind of screw
fall
up, right?
of 2019. So 3.5.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Been rolling. Done some client work together. A couple clients.
Yeah.
Shared clients. So maybe before we get into the topic, which will be about brand and the impact of brand and that on marketing performance, we want to hear a little bit about brand heroes and what you guys are focused on. So why don't you give us an intro, Mike?
Excellent. All right. The brand pitch. Well, first off, I read a lot of comics as a kid, so that's kind of what informed the name. And kind of true to the name, I always loved Superman as a kid. And, I realized Superman never showed up in good times. It was Clark Kent. Superman only really showed up in bad times, helped right the wrongs, and then he flew away. And I always thought that was an interesting model for an agency, especially in a really fragmented world of agencies. So Brand Heroes was born out of the idea of staying vigilant, being there when we're needed, and when we're not, we kind of, we put away the cape, we become Clark Kent, but we stay close enough that we can help out our clients as they need us. So what we really do is 2 main things. We build their brand and we tell their story. And every now and then we get to build their brand and tell their story. But we get to show up in those moments where clients really start to talk about who they are, what they believe, and then what that means about how they actually engage customers and deliver some of the results that's most important to them. So that's really it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Building off the the superhero tie-in, it's sort of like, don't you find brand is sort of the unsung hero of marketing?
100%.
Like we're so quick to say it's performance marketing or it's the lead gen, it's the product or whatever. But really, if you don't have a great brand behind all of that, it's probably not going to meet the expectations that you have.
Well, you know what? Like I look at my own history, and I don't know about you guys, but the years from about grade 8 to grade 10 were probably pretty awkward. And I remember in grade 10, I look back at this old picture of mine, and I bought these pants, and I thought they were the greatest pants ever. And I'm like, everybody has these pants, and they're going to love them. And I put on these pants for photo day, and I'm like, these pants are not me. And I got laughed out. And I kept that photo because that was my very first introduction into branding right there. It's like branding versus design. The design might be cool, but the brand does not support that at all.
Right. Yeah. Yet somehow you were wearing them. That's so crazy. That's a good point. But you're right. You're right, Kev. Like it's if it's one of those things that you can easily forget about.
Yeah.
Hey, everything looks cohesive. Everything's fitting together here. Everything's really at that high level from a brand perspective, and then your marketing campaign does really well. Right. Yeah. And it's like, oh, you must have done a great job on lead generation.
But it's just so important, I think. And we definitely want to hear more from Mike. He's the brand expert, but I just think every organization is a little different. Even if you're in a hyper concentrated technology vertical or whatever, you have to tell the story to you. You can't tell the stories to someone else, and that's what you have to create.
Yeah.
And it starts with brand to that point.
Well, it totally does. But, it's one of those things, too, that, brands can function a little bit in the background. And it's easy to sort of believe that it's all good until it's not. And I think that's something we saw during COVID, where brands were taking big, big inward looks. And some of them were actually having these massive existential crises because they were saying, look, like, the bottom's falling out of the economy, the bottom's falling out of our sales funnel. We got to kind of look at who we are and what we ultimately believe. Sure. And then take that and bring that back up to the decisions we make from a sales standpoint and the decisions we make from an operations standpoint. And, from tech, it's always interesting because tech is so cool and technology products are so cool. And I find, I always joke around with my team that I feel like when we market tech products, we're both their best friend and their worst enemy, because we'll come in and say, tell us the 3 things you love about what you're doing. And the answer we'll get is, hey, we love 20 things. We'll be like, nope, 3, just 3. That's all we need.
Yeah. Well, maybe before we get too down into the topic, let's hear a little bit more about brand heroes, maybe from like what, I know you gave us the really cool background of the name, but what got you into it, and maybe how long have you been running it now? Because it's been certainly not a brand new agency. Right, it's been around for a bit. You guys have been doing this for a while now. So maybe what inspired you to kind of go agency world, and how long you've been doing it for?
I don't know. I just seem to love pain, and just, I don't know.
That's good.
I'm allergic to peace, I think. So it'll be actually 15 years this coming September 29th.
Good for you.
15 years, and oddly enough, if we trace that back, our first official day with the shingle on the door was September 29th, 2008. So when the world was imploding financially, I actually thought it was a great time to start an agency because a lot of the legacy relationships that define agencies totally went out the window during a recession. And, not that it's our long-term strategy, but from a very short-term perspective, I felt like we could disrupt a little bit by coming in and saying, we're going to do work that's on par with your agency of record, but we're going to do it a lot cheaper. We're going to do it a lot more comprehensively. And by the way, half the staff that your agency let go is actually on our roster. So we can offer a lot of parity with that. But what got me into brands specifically actually began before I could even call myself a marketer. I was working in television. I started off as a television producer, and I was producing a show on YTV about video games called Video and Arcade Top 10.
Oh yeah,
I remember
Do you guys remember that show?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that was at one point in time, it was the longest running kids show in Canada.
Yeah.
And we had just passed, I think, our 12th season. And up until that point, they only had one sponsor. It was always Nintendo, and they always played Nintendo games. And I got called into my boss's office, and she said, listen, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is you're promoted. I'm like, that's great. What's the bad news? She's like, Nintendo just pulled out.
No.
So you got to figure out what our next steps are, and you got to rebrand the entire show.
Oh, wow.
So the first thing I did is I went and looked up what branding means, because I had no idea what she was talking about. And then the second thing was it started making me kind of go down that path of thinking about, okay, what is the brand of the show? Who is our audience truly? And gaming at that point in time was growing up significantly. So it wasn't just about kids anymore. It was about adults, and it was about the love that they had for the games. And gaming was also crossing over this really interesting chasm where it became multi-generational. So the games we all grew up with playing, now our kids are starting to play those games. So what I started to really fall in love with was this notion of an experience that I grew up with was more than just the experience of playing the game. It was so much more than that.
Right.
And that's what led me down the path of brands. And what led me to the agency world was that when I started kind of my own journey from creative into business, I kind of realized that was a little bit of a rare thing in the industry, particularly in advertising. And I wanted a model that sort of flattened the relationship between the account side and the creative side and the strategy side. So Brand Heroes was sort of born to try and kind of flatten that structure so that all of those functions get in front of the client, and we have the ability to bring them into the sandbox with us. So that's That's the long and short, really.
That's really cool. If we get that as a little snippet, because I feel like that'd be a good snippet.
Nice snippet.
Can we get the YTV? Like, can we cut in some of that show?
That logo as well.
Or like even like a little version of like the show for like 10 seconds? Can we look at that? That'd be
But you're right, Mike. Something in the story there they showed that the YTV example, it's a really good one. Is the brand and the brand strategy has to be this ever delicate balance of what is it that your audience like about you, and what do your audience sort of really resonate with, where balanced with where do you think the industry is going. So in that example, you're like, okay, well, we're seeing multi-generational use now. We're seeing a broadening of market because it's not just for kids anymore. It's now for, I don't know, teenagers, young adults, etc. Possibly even like family bonding time. I remember playing like Super Mario Brothers with my parents kind of thing in Duck Hunt back in the day. Yeah. So it's funny that you're like, it's got to be that balance of what are we today and how do we resonate with our audience and where do we think it's going such that we're positioned properly. And if we go back to your COVID example, like I was trying to think of a company, but there's probably some organizations that are like, we're the ultimate in-person meeting company. And then COVID happens and you're just completely sideswiped by this black swan event.
Yeah.
And you're completely in the opposite side of where you want to be as a brand. Mm-hmm. So I think that's hard to predict, but the evolving nature of your industry and offering is really key to brand.
I love that example because that happened to WeWork and the WeWorks of the world.
Yeah.
And, WeWork, I mean, they went through all sorts of other stuff.
There are stories there.
That could be a separate podcast unto itself. But what was kind of neat, if you looked at the way the co-working spaces eventually kind of shifted their own positioning, was they went from being the ultimate in-person destination to now being the answer to what hybrid work should ultimately be.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And they got on side with that really quickly during the pandemic. Because as organizations were starting to kind of recognize the needs of their staff and say that, look, like we have an office downtown, somebody's moved out an hour and a half away. They don't want to commute in 3 times a week to the office. That's where the WeWorks of the world were really able to shine. And that's where they were able to show up. And the brand helped get them there. I mean, it took a lot from an operations standpoint, a lot from a sales standpoint. But I think what the brand did in that particular case is it helped draw a map that helped people sort of see what the present could look like and what the future could look like. And then you can map your operations right against that.
Yeah. There's even some like minor repositioning that too, where it's like many companies were just canceling and pulling out of leases. And they said, well, we're not going back to that in the near term. But, if you want a short term sort of
pop up.
Or or like limited liability as opposed to like something way bigger. Well, we could be a stopgap for you there. So that's smart positioning too, and being really reactive to a pretty dynamic time.
Totally.
Yeah. And I wonder, this is maybe a good pivot into how, like what we're seeing, and I know Chris wants to ask some questions about the role, but the role that brand plays in really having a successful marketing campaign, because it's bigger than just the campaign, right? But maybe that's a direction that we can head in, because nowadays we're seeing people kind of retool their marketing. They've been operating kind of the same way for a while now, and they're almost saying, okay, we need better pipeline. We need to sort of reshape what we're doing from a marketing perspective. In some cases, they're saying the revenue owner is going to be playing a much bigger role in the decisions that are happening from a marketing perspective and how we're going to align our marketing with our sales effort. So at that point, it's almost like, well, geez, we might need to rethink a lot of this stuff, right? Before we start spending even more money on marketing programs. So maybe we can talk a little bit about, the role that like you see, like I think what we're seeing on the front line, where you might say, you know what, time out, guys, you should, before we start getting even into more campaigning here, let's take a step back and evaluate your brand and what's occurring there.
Yeah, I was just going to throw in, we're going way back here to the times when, sales and marketing had completely different, schedules, completely different lunchrooms, etc.
Yeah.
And they were kind of like on opposite, they were somewhat, there was a lot that they did not agree on. Put it that way. Okay. Yeah. And I'm sure 15 years in the business, you remember those times. So now we've got a different kind of world where, where it's much more, it's not just acceptable, but like really critical that the two are speaking off the same song sheet. And then, we deal primarily with companies that maybe don't have the Nike, the Nike name, or that like the large sort of, name. You need to actually make a really good product. Your brand has to be productive. And
Right.
so I'm really curious about, when you get into these conversations now where revenue is such an important part of the conversation, no matter what it is that you're making an investment or signing a PO for, how do you help an organization understand the importance of a proper and appropriate sort of brand strategy?
It's a great question. And if I can get like a little academic for a sec, there's a theory that I love. And Michael, you've probably heard me say this a bunch of times, so I'm going to apologize in advance for saying it again. But it was created by a Harvard professor, legendary Harvard professor named Theodore Levitt. And it goes something like this: marketers sell the drill, consumers buy the whole. And when you kind of strip it back, what I kind of like to think about that is, unless you're a huge fan of drills, and even if you are, you're still not buying the drill. But most of the time, what are you actually buying? Like if you're going to buy the drill and you're putting up a picture, or you're putting up a TV, or you're putting a board in your dock so that your kids could have these fun memories jumping off the dock of the cottage, the drill becomes the enabler of that experience. And this is a hard lesson for a lot of product marketers because it's easy to fall in love with the product. It's easy to fall in love with the technology. But at the end of the day, what really matters is that whole and the experience that whole enables. So I think where it becomes an interesting conversation, kind of marrying brand up with sales, is to kind of talk through salespeople about what are you actually selling at the end of the day?
Sure.
And what are people actually buying at the end of the day too? Because every buyer is accountable to their consumers, to their internal audiences. And there sort of comes a point where the tangible product kind of, I don't want to say it no longer becomes important, because it's very important, but it doesn't become the full story. And brand helps kind of round out that story. But brand by itself also isn't enough too. So I think the relationship with branders and salespeople is so important, because you have to bring those two together. So that's kind of where I see that headed.
And I think that kind of almost goes to part of what you'd brought up at the beginning, where the unsung hero and potentially even a bit of criticism that product marketers might have over brand marketers, to be able to say like, hey, well, that's not really getting us anywhere.
Right.
It's too disconnected from what we're. So I think there's maybe what you touched on was like that balancing act, or that connection point where it's like, yeah, we're not just, we're still a drill company. We don't want people to be confused that we're selling paintings,
right,
or we're not a dock company, but it's telling that story in such a way that those connection points are there. And I think maybe even more to your point about the sales component, where ultimately the sales team needs to understand it. It can't be so out there that, they revert to, well, hey, this thing's got a 3 1/4-inch chuck, and is that what they call it? A chuck on the drill? A chuck? Remember that? And
I don't know a thing about drills.
You don't? Jeez,
you're way handier than
It's
I
only
am.
holes. Nothing about drills.
Yeah, and it's a half horsepower. You know what I'm saying though? Like
Yeah.
I think that's part of it.
Oh, 100% it is. And, I think about, and, hopefully I'm not calling out any clients of yours with this, but a few years ago, we switched our accounting platform. We went from FreshBooks to QuickBooks. And, there was a million reasons why we needed to do it. And our accountant basically told us to do it. And he said, on a product level, QuickBooks is going to give you a lot more features. But on a brand level, with FreshBooks, they have this beautiful imagery. It's all woodland creatures.
Super modern.
Super modern, this great mission. And, it stuck with me. Being a brand guy, I bought into it hook, line, and sinker. And I remember when I moved over to QuickBooks, they didn't have any of that. So I felt like I was disconnected from the mission.
Yeah.
And even though from a product basis, I would suggest QuickBooks is probably a superior product, it actually created a larger learning curve for me. So on a tangible level and on a sales level, when it came time to look at upgrading the product, I was actually really resistant to doing it because I didn't feel that same affinity to it. So I think that's just one of many examples where a brand-based problem could meet a very real sales-based problem as well, and the two could potentially help each other out a little bit.
100%. Yeah. Like I think of that example in particular around, QuickBooks and being such a large organization, you know, and
but there's a lot of like sort of like emotional representation there. It's like, well, now we're growing up. We're not on like the cool, fun, more connected platform. Now we're in the QuickBooks, which is a lot bigger shoes to fill, and now we're a real business. And like, there's so many additional thoughts that might seep through your brain there, where you're like, okay, it's time to.
It's almost like it's almost like, was that a deliberate positioning point where hey, we want to be perceived as more of an enterprise product, so we're taking all that stuff away, or was it just a lack of brand vision, to your point, where Intuit doesn't have that? Because I mean, they bought MailChimp, right?
Right.
And MailChimp had that, I think, more of what you're describing. That
more recently, but I actually wonder if it was the opposite. If that's kind of always how QuickBooks saw themselves, because they're like, well, look, we're kind of like a bigger business accounting solution than FreshBooks as the younger company. The two says, hey, this is our entry point to small and medium business, and we think we can differentiate in part on some of these kinds of things.
What's really cool is that, like, I mean, the accounting background is that QuickBooks was the small player for the longest time.
Right.
Which leads me to the 100%. Question that I had for you earlier today, which is, so you must get in conversations with companies that are like, we've been this thing for whatever period of time that we've been, by accident or on purpose or whatever. And we're kind of like in a bit of a stale state. What kinds of things would sort of indicate that it's time for a rebrand? You're talking about the superhero, like good times, bad times. What kind of things do you sort of talk to a client about when it's maybe time to consider a rebrand? And how do you kind of help them into that decision, like in terms of what's the result of a rebrand?
Right. So there's so many, it's a great question. There's so many indicators. I think one of the big ones is, who are you seen as versus who you really are and who you can be and who you can kind of grow into. And there's some wonderful examples of these legacy heritage brands that have been around for years, but they're really known for one thing, even though they do a lot of different things. And that's a point where that could be one indicator that either a rebrand or a refresh is interesting, because you look at, like, from a dollars and cents standpoint, nobody wants to leave money on the table. But when it comes down to it, if people know you for X and you say, okay, well, you love us for X, imagine if you knew about Y and Z. And they say, nope, I know you for X, you're X, I'm going to go over here for Y and Z. And you're like, but we do these things better. We're doing them way better. We're putting in this investment. And they're like, nope, know you for X. And the challenge becomes, too, that if you invest in more of those other lines of businesses, you could run the risk of cannibalizing the one that you know really well, too. So from a portfolio standpoint, it becomes a little bit of a risky game. So where brand can help with that, and they're by no means the only player in this equation, but it's to start to kind of take a look at your total value proposition as an organization, where you drive meaningful, unique value, and then start to kind of carve that up into your product offerings and your segments. And that might be the moment you might kind of suggest, maybe we do need to explore a brand. Maybe our brand isn't big enough to support where our dreams have gone as a company and where we've started kind of punching above our weight. And actually, we just rebranded, and that was a big reason why we did, because we had some success in one area, but we had a lot of other areas that we wanted to explore, and we just felt like at that point it wasn't a believable enough story to the marketplace why we're here.
Right.
So we needed to change the story.
That's really interesting.
Another. I was actually just listening to it was a podcast with the company Zapier, or sorry, Zapier. I always get the name wrong, but they were talking about that too, and what they sort of said was, and this kind of built on what you were saying, is they realized that the brand they'd established and kind of grown up with now didn't meet their user base and how their user base thought of them and where they were taking their solutions. So they felt like we almost had to level up to where the market now sees us, and we felt like we couldn't actually grow with some of these companies that have grown if we didn't materially change how we present ourselves.
Totally. And that's a great part of it too, that your brand is for yourself. but it's also for your customers too, because it's a very like-minded kind of relationship that
Oh
you have.
man, just like the FreshBooks example, you were
Absolutely.
connected with it.
Absolutely. And, you know, like Apple's one of the biggest proponents of this too. And, you know, a lot of people on the Apple bandwagon say, like, this is way beyond a product. It's who they are. It's who they
It's an
identify
ecosystem.
with.
It's a lifestyle. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's tricky too, because you get into some pretty sensitive issues around rebrands too, because, you know, your team, depending on how long they've been in the organization, they might have a lot of heart and affinity for who you were, and they don't necessarily want to see that change.
And they're part of what that brand has now become, right? They've contributed to it.
Totally. Same with your customers. Like if you have legacy accounts, you know, you're also worried about how that customer is going to feel if suddenly they see you differently. And are they going to want to be there? And, you know, the example you bring up is an amazing one, because I think about, like, if I'm thinking in my head, what are all their different accounts that they have, and what are the age of those accounts? What kind of socialization would they have had to do before they launched that rebrand to those account teams to make sure they're comfortable with that? Because you don't want to alienate them in any way.
Yes. Yeah.
Something that we joke about a bit too on like sort of like the B2B side. In particular, it's usually like software and tech companies is, you know, there's all sorts of M&A all the time.
Right.
And there's what we call like the classic 3 steps for the acquisition. So first it's the acquisition, there's no changes, parent company and other company. And then very quietly it becomes child company by parent company or powered by. And then eventually it kind of gets to a point where now the child company's just sucked up under it's the new cloud of the parent company.
Yeah.
And that all happens.
And they're like a page on the website.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a 18 to 24 month process, and it's like the classic way to do it. Like, what are your thoughts around how would you assess doing that? What would the structure of your process you'd be in doing that properly? Like, what are the steps, I guess, at a high level?
You know, it's so funny because, like, I mean, I geek out on this sort of stuff, but like if I think about like what are some of the more contentious conversations you can have with someone over a beer or a coffee, that's one of them. Because like
politics, branding.
Politics, branding, weather, hockey, you know. Yeah. But like if you're purchasing an organization, you're purchasing them for so many different reasons. And, you know, sometimes there's so many different questions that kind of come into it. But the reality is there's huge equity in that brand. But then as you try and kind of merge it within the organizational structure, the question kind of becomes, do we leave that alone? Do we let it sort of play on its own a little bit? Do we, like I look at Kudo within the TELUS environment. Kudo for years was like this cool, funky brand. They wore neon colors. You just want to leave that brand alone. You want them to do their thing. You don't want to call it Kudo by TELUS. And TELUS has huge equity in its own right. But it's two very different missions. It's two very different kind of personalities.
Yeah.
And you don't really want to cross the streams, to use a Ghostbusters reference.
Yeah.
But then as you start to fold it in a little bit and you think, okay, well, what are some potential synergies from a sales standpoint? What are some potential operational efficiencies? Is there some liability for us in actually keeping that brand separate? And are we actually starting to lose equity as an organization?
Because of it,
Yeah, is the child brand starting to actually get more powerful than the parent brand? And that's where you might want to start bringing that in a little more and kind of bringing that in.
I think that's a great call because we see a lot of time like it's the larger companies who are acquiring the more nimble ones, in part because it's a bit of a future protection or a future proofing, right?
Yeah, and you know, you guys, like, you talk about like Salesforce, for example. Like I remember years ago, like in like the Radiant 6 acquisition.
Yes,
You know, good Canadian company.
Yeah.
And you know,
Halifax,
that was
right? I think.
Yeah. And I think for a while they let them keep their name, didn't they?
For a bit,
Yep.
Yeah, but then eventually it just got kind of folded into the structure a little bit.
I think now it's just like it's the social arm of Marketing Cloud, I think. Because they combine Radiant 6 with a few other kind of social tools as well. I can't even name them all, but
And at the time, you know, Radiant 6 felt like sorcery. Like, you know, in my circles, it's like, oh, Radiant 6. It's like this thing you look up at and you're like, this is amazing.
no, you're right. That's exactly it.
But when the name got taken away, I thought, oh, okay, well, there we go. It's just something else. It's just another set of tools out there. And the equity, for me, kind of got totally sucked away from that. I'm sure there was strategy behind
100%. Yeah.
But-
Yeah, I mean, you see that, like, I think we saw that with a couple of their acquisitions, right? Like, people really bought into, maybe it was partially timing in the industry, because like you said, it was magical, or it was like sorcery. I think a lot of the tech tools at that time were sort of viewed that way. Like, wow, I can actually do this with an exact target or a whatever. So the marketers were like, dude, like we use this tool, and then all of a sudden it gets bought by Salesforce or an acquirer, and you're like, this is weird, right?
So speaking of Salesforce, there's one in particular rebrand I'm very curious to watch. And I think what we've seen over the last, I'm going to say 5 years, could be a bit more, is we've seen the sort of the explosion of like the dominance of tech into like consumer world, right? And the one that's really interesting to me is Slack. Huge acquisition by any metric, especially price tag. So Slack has become this thing. It's a verb. It's almost like Kleenex now.
Yeah.
Slack me this, Slack me that, right?
Yeah.
Watch me on my Slack channels. And so I'm not going to say that they're bigger than the Salesforce universe, like you were saying before, but you can't just roll Slack under the comms cloud.
No.
Like, and so how do you deal with that? I think that one's going to be fascinating.
Well, it's funny because I'd love to sort of dive deeper. Maybe you guys can provide some insights around maybe the rationale between that acquisition. But to me, in some ways, Slack almost seems like the opportunity to make Salesforce kind of cool. And Salesforce is cool in its own right, but Slack.
But not as cool as Slack.
Not Slack cool.
No. Yeah. I mean, they've got their trailheads, and they've really tried to push the woodland creatures, and Salesforce has really tried hard to sort of make it more than just a corporate entity. Like, I think they're probably one out of the people that they compete with that's done the most to sort of pull that, right?
Easily.
Yeah, and Slack has that cultural element to it. It's reached that point as a brand and as an iconic brand that it just becomes part of a behavior. Even if you're not using Slack, you're right, it is the Kleenex. And it's funny because we're a Google shop through and through. And we had talked as an organization about whether we bring Slack into our workplace. And with Google, within their stack, you have access to Google Chat, which is basically like Slack without any of the cool.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Anyway.
Yeah. And I also think that it's so interesting when you brought up this whole Salesforce, and I know we're deviating a little bit on the discussion, but at one point, bringing in Salesforce was the cool thing to do.
Yes.
Right, Chris? Oh. You're competing on ERPs or CRMs, and the cloud-based CRM.
Listen, you had to convince people that it was okay to put your data up there.
Right.
That was a huge deal.
The cool thing. And then I think to the point now, it's there's an element where Salesforce is not cool. It doesn't have that same.
It has become a bit more bulky.
But then I'm thinking, what's Slack? Slack is the new way that many organizations are communicating, are exchanging information internally, externally, right? So it's that's almost like the new cloud-based CRM that they had, that cachet they had 15 years ago, where some people are violently against Slack, right? We've seen this. We're not using Slack, send an email. You know what I mean? Just send an email. I think now maybe with COVID sort of push that a little bit more, where Google Chat and other things have become, better. But, people be we don't need that. We don't need that. And then you see these other organizations this actually really helps our workflow. This is a game changer for us as an organization, right?
Emotional.
It's emotional.
It's emotional. It was emotional back when Salesforce came out with, hey, it's all safe in the cloud. It was emotional for a lot of people to sort of open that door and say, you know what, I'm going to be okay with this at some point.
Hugely emotional. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But what you're pointing to, and Michael, I like the way you said this, that Salesforce back in the day was cool.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about my kids, because I got a 9-year-old daughter. And, at the best of time, my jokes might land maybe 3 out of 10 times. But, with her and her friends, they land 0 out of 10 times now, right? And it makes me realize that that's the journey of a lot of legacy brands. You might think you're cool. You might think you're hip. You may very well be cool and hip. But as you grow up and you accumulate more responsibility, brands also adult the way that we do, right?
And expectations around that.
And they got to realize that. If they want to grow, if they want to continue to be in that dominant position, they got to be the adult, and they got to leave the hipster stuff to some other brands. And that's where a Slack acquisition makes sense, because they can be cool, but they could be cool through Slack. Yeah. And they could use Slack as a tip of the spear kind of funnel for them to bring people into it.
Yeah.
Particularly the markets that really resonate with Slack. But then as they come in through Slack, they can stay for the power of Salesforce.
Grow them up, yeah.
It's still emotional, but it's It's sort of like, you guys remember like the old Carlsberg years campaign of "Welcome to your Carlsberg years."
yeah.
You know, that was a great campaign for people coming out of school, which I was at the time. But then there gets to a point where it's like, you know what, my Carlsberg years are done.
No, that was hilarious. Well, guys, it's been 30 minutes. What else do we want to talk about?
We had a few items that we wanted to talk about. Like, I think, Mike, I'm curious to get your take. How do you think of, like, what's the role of brand in like lead generation? Like, a lot of our clients they're focused on lead generation. It's sort of the number one priority of marketing and sales together. How do you think of brand, and what kind of role does it play there in campaign or performance success?
It's a fantastic question. I think the brand creates a lot of the foundation for the lead gen work to really do its work. Like, for example, like I think about, like, if you're putting an acquisition campaign out there and you want someone to click right through to a lead gen form, you're maybe going to have, 3 to 4 seconds of their time? You know, and you got to get them in that headspace where they're ready to do that. They're ready to take that action.
Yes.
But in order to get them to that point, they will have had to go through all sorts of other stages of the funnel. I have to know who you are. They will have had to engage with you on some
Most
level.
of those would be dark or non-attributable. Like, we can't measure it. We have
Right.
no idea.
Right. But you know if it's not there. Because it's like, you know, and sorry guys, I'm bringing up high school way too often, but it's like if you, like, you know, ask someone on a date and they're not ready to say yes, you're screwed.
We talk about that so much. I'm sorry to cut you off with our campaigns. Like, a lot of our clients, because there's pressures, and I'll just call it impatience, but everyone wants to generate right away.
Of course.
But it's like, you can't go for the kill right away if they don't know who you are and how to view you in context to some of the problems they may be having or challenges.
Absolutely. And, you know, and it's hard, right? Because you have so many competing pressures in an organization. You know, you have to make your sales. You have to make your numbers. But at the same token, I think back to the idea that, you know, nobody wants to leave money on the table. I feel like, and Chris, I'd love to get your perspective on this. I've never felt like personally anybody I've seen has fully realized the potential of their sales funnel. Like there's always opportunities they could grow a little bit. So, you know, from a lead gen perspective, if there is lead gen opportunities that are very natural for them, take those. If there's some where they're not at that point yet to go for a lead gen type of scenario, but they're more in consideration, they're more in awareness, take those. But there's plenty of opportunity to kind of grow your funnel and grow your business. And I think brand shows up in all three of those areas. But with lead gen in particular, it becomes the conscience. It's the great Goose sitting on your shoulder saying, are you actually ready to actually do this? Are you ready to kind of go in for that lead right now?
Yeah.
Yeah,
What do you think, Chris?
I like the concept of the message going all the way through the entire pipeline. I think that's really, really important. How important it is to, you know, the brand visual, the brand message, the messaging that's coming out of sales, going back full circle to what we started with, which was that sort of integration of sales and marketing, you know, being, you know, cooperative on the message, right?
Well, you know, I was thinking, I don't know, a few years now, ABM, like the rise of account-based marketing, has kind of done this too, and exposed like this, like what we've all known, there's a gap between marketing and sales. And so now we need marketing or sales and marketing alignment. And what we've decided, appropriately, I suppose, is we need to rebrand that effort. So now we've called it can't be MOps because it's still got marketing in its name.
Yeah.
So now we're like, it's revenue ops. And at least we can both agree that if we being marketing and we being sales, if we can agree that our goal together is to sell more, we're okay with revenue ops. And that's like the ultimate rebrand here.
It's sexy sounding, but you know, it's kind of polarizing too. Cause like I have some colleagues that I've done some work with that when you say the words performance marketing, and these are branders, and they'll be like, come on, like branding's performance marketing.
Yeah.
And then performance marketers will say, no, it's not.
That is a touchy one. And even
yeah.
even like the cutting edge marketers, they're like, oh, performance marketing was so 3 years ago. No one talks like that anymore because it's sort of, it assumes that you're just going for the MQL.
Yeah.
We don't do MQLs
Yeah,
anymore.
we got to rebrand. Yeah, we got
Yeah.
to rebrand Goose Digital now. But I also think one of the things you guys were talking about, you and Chris, was that like I think we forget that our message doesn't land the first time. Right. So sometimes you're like, oh, I got to come up with like 15 different messages here, right? And it's like, well, you know, they probably didn't really get it the first 3 or 4 times that you put it in front of them. So like a crazy example of a rug company that, because we bought one rug and my wife was saying that, oh, I get like 4 or 5 emails from them in 2 days. Like at one point there was like 4 in a day on whatever they were doing. But essentially when I looked at them, it was like they have these events that occur, and what they're doing is they're like reiterating, hey, by the way, this event is going on. Don't miss like it was, as I looked through them, it's like, this isn't like 4 or 5 unique messages. And this is a campaign basis. I realize a little bit different than what we're talking about, but generally speaking, they were just reiterating that brand proposition, that campaign proposition multiple times, because they know, oh, I saw that once on LinkedIn or Facebook. I didn't really digest that, right? And I think that's partially a big I think thing for people to understand, that it's easy to just come up with 8 or 9 different, 10 different value props and spit them out there. And it's like, well, I don't know that they got it on the first 1 or 2. So down the funnel, to your point of like consistency and reiterate, I think that's really, really something to take away here from a branding.
It's an interesting example, because I wonder, like, for your wife, when she saw email number 1 versus like the last email, what was her patience level to that company?
I asked that too, and I thought, she's like, oh no, I just get those, but I get those messages. It wasn't like an issue for her, and I thought, well, that seems like a lot to me, but no, but I know it's a St. Patrick's Day event that they're having, and it's all
so
good.
It's timely, but it's also like she's sort of in market for a rug, right? So I guess she's looking at this and like, this is actually kind of helpful to my decision making right now.
Yeah, and I think what probably was different, I didn't ask this, but like I'm sure from email 1 to email 4 or 5, she now understood what was going on. I bet you by email 1 she didn't. It was like, oh, okay, in and out, right?
She's a rug expert now.
Yeah, now she's a rug
She
expert.
could sell it for them.
Yeah. But I found that was kind of interesting.
So question for you guys then, not to take over your podcast, but just curious your thoughts on this. At what point does gamification kind of play a role in that customer journey there?
Well, we've done some. Question. I mean, we've done some with clients before. I think it's generally been more for consumer, like for B2C kind of stuff so far.
Depends though, right? It depends on the use. So like, what are the goals of the campaign, I guess? And even then, how are you thinking about depicting it? Like, there's a few technologies I can think of where they almost gamify the onboarding. Yeah. So after you've either bought your subscription or maybe you're doing a trial, they're trying to step you through, well, if we can get you through these 3 modules of our platform, you will see the value. So they almost gamify, get your star here, get your thing there. I mean, Trailblazer is probably the biggest gamified B2B experience you could have. So I think it does depend. The majority of our engagements are around lead generation or like supporting RevOps. So there is less gamification there. I think, though, as a sort of bridge to that, something that we've seen a bit when we're talking about educational or nurture campaigns for audiences, it's less so gamified, but it's more like, well, this is email 1 of a 4 email series. And sometimes we'll even have like a little sort of status bar. It's like block 2 is highlighted because that's the second email. Just try to set the expectation. There are 3 more of these. Sometimes we've experimented with, you're getting them for the next 4 Tuesdays, and we can kind of wire up the sequence.
But that's interesting, because like, you made me think about, like, for your example, about even kind of showcasing for someone if they come in at a premium model for software and then showing them what waits for them if they upgrade. Yeah. It almost feels like the gamified element to that is just fear of missing out.
Yeah, and I think part of what you're touching on, I think, is really interesting, because we do a lot of customer marketing as well. So we kind of like, I think a big part of our business is at the top end, and then like from a lead generation, there's nurturing. Obviously, we're doing all those types of steps. Right. But then it's at the bottom end. It's like, hey, you've got a whole bunch of customers. And it made me think, when you're talking about gamification, that means so many things, right? To me, it almost feels like a way to interact with the brand that is fun and not necessarily has to be tied to like a status bar. So I think of like Wordle, right? We all got hooked on that thing.
Still am.
Still am. I could see almost like some of our clients that have, 50,000, 100,000 customers a year, doing something like that from a brand perspective, say, hey, we do a game every 2 weeks and we're sending it to you. And it's something kind of like a Wordle experience where the person receiving that would be like, hey, this is just a totally cool thing that I'm doing. And maybe you do garner points and you get a little bit of like, hey, I'm a top 10 Wordle for X brand, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's purely around top of mind awareness of that brand and keeping you connected to that organization. So
think
that
there's-
like, let's say the rug example. Hey, we got a rug puzzle.
Yeah.
And you're sliding them around and it's rugs and it
that's
reveals
fun.
a cool,
That's cool.
you know, and it's something you can do twice a week or twice a month.
It is
and it's
cool. And you're creating those associations right away. And you're also turning the customer into your marketer because you're feeding them
That's
all your
great
important
call.
language
Yeah.
right off the top.
love
But you think of the movement now, and it's going to go more this way, especially with the macro economy stuff. Is the big thing now in B2B is product led growth.
Yes.
And I think the days of the subscription stuff, whether it's like per user per month times 100 years because that's the contract or whatever else, that's going away in part. And it's going to be more about, well, how much of the platform are you using? And as the product led motion, it's more like stepping them through. Well,
getting
start
them
off at the
using
lower
it.
tier,
Yeah, for
get
sure.
them up, and I think the gamification will become a really important part
100%, I like
of
that.
PLG and where that
100%.
goes. So B2B, I think that's a really
what's
hot
PLG?
space.
What's PLG?
Product-led growth.
But
Jeez.
from a PLG standpoint,
Oh, I love
see,
it.
I'm trying to use your vernacular so I remember it. The brand, I think, plays such a role in that because if you want people to expand their share of product, you got to show them the moments in their life where that can actually show up for them in a much bigger and much more comprehensive way. Like we use Sprout Social for our social. And it made me realize, right, we need to actually layer up and upgrade our plan to be able to include a whole bunch of functionality that they've built onto it that I didn't actually realize they even have.
Yeah.
And
So that's it.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
totally it. And it's funny because it was the easiest sales call ever because I didn't need selling on it. All I needed was to actually read the emails they've been sending me for the last few years to realize that it's there.
Yeah, and let's face it, if you get like hey, you're now the Sprout Elite, not even from a plan perspective, but like because like what you're saying, product led growth, we can tell that you're using these areas of the system.
Right.
You're a Sprout Elite domain or brand on our platform.
Oh, can you
that makes you
imagine?
feel good. It's like, hey, I'm using everything that's in
Yeah.
here. I'm not. Oh,
I'm a super
I'm
user.
4 out of 5.
But I hear
Why am I 4
that,
out of 5?
and I'm like, then the whole community marketing element really takes off. It's like, well, we have these conferences. We're going to showcase you as one of our
Yep.
premier elite partners. We'd love you for you to come speak.
But
and
what
it's
a
big
way for them
thing.
to introduce other features too.
Yeah.
Because like, oh, I was a 5 out of 5 for a year, and Sprout just dropped another element, and now I'm a 4.5 out of 5. Well, wait, why? Right? I want to.
Well, maybe Sprout Social is super smart, and they're like, we're going to take all of our elites. We've got this new thing we're rolling out. Let's have them pilot it first, get some high quality feedback,
Yep.
and then we can bridge you into now you're the 6 out of 6 functionality, right?
Yeah.
Totally. And there's a whole bunch of people like you that will
Yes.
resonate with
Yeah.
that type of
Oh
type
man,
of
and you're
sell.
just gonna. That's all I want to be around, and
Yeah,
like
it's
these
cool.
like-minded people, and maybe to round it out full circle is that's like the brand affinity, right?
Yeah.
You're forever going to be locked into that because this is me, who I am, my community, my organization. It's a huge part of the things I do for this organization, and
Love it.
You're just now completely one to the brand, and thus brand marketing is super important.
Guys, I think you got to invoice Sprout Social for this because
Yeah.
you just drove value for them.
100%. Yeah, let's get them on the
We've
podcast.
also got some PLG ideas for marketing. And,
Yeah.
Well, we're gonna open up a PLG division, a gamification PLG division.
Right on.
All right, I think we're really happy with this 45-minute-er. This is the longest one we've done in a while. 50-minute-er. Oh,
50. We should have wrapped up. And then we got talking about the other.
I
fun
want
stuff.
700 clips, okay, out of this podcast. No.
Can we do a telethon? We'll talk for the next day.
Yeah, can we get a caller? We'll take a caller online too. That's a great idea. We should do that. All right. Well, I think probably next will be on your podcast. Because
Absolutely.
lots of really good stuff. We could probably be riff on this stuff forever. But really, thanks for coming down, Mike, and spending some
Thank
time with
you.
us. And
Thanks, Mike.
I
was
know
a lot of fun.
You guys.
I know our customers and probably co-customers are gonna get some value off this conversation today. So that's wild.
Really appreciate it, guys. It was fun. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, let's go for lunch. Cheers.